A man's hands tremble as he gingerly inserts nitroglycerin into a hole drilled in the rock. Suspended high above the treacherous Sierra Nevada wilderness in a basket woven from reeds, he gazes up at the sheer, unforgiving granite cliff face towering above him. The hiss of a match is followed by the sputter of a fuse catching flame. He sends a signal, a loud whistle, for the men holding the basket to begin pulling him up. He can only hope that they heard him over the wind as the fire begins creeping towards the explosives. But the basket doesn't move. He whistles again as the flame continues to move closer and closer to the hole in the cliff, but still his basket doesn't move. His pulse pounds in his ears. He whistles frantically and begins to shout, "What could be happening? What could be happening? Is this how it will end for him, blown apart on the side of a cliff in the middle of nowhere, 1,000 miles from his home?" But then, a sudden tug on the rope jolts him back to hope. The basket begins to ascend, agonizingly, achingly slow. His eyes shut tight. He braces for the explosion, his breath caught in his chest, wondering if he'll make it out alive. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was a feat of human might, ambition, and engineering, as well as a story of unbelievable corruption and death. Today, we're going to dive into the brave people, the great race, and the horrific tragedies that created the railroad, which connected the entire United States. Come along to discover the story of how the Transcontinental Railroad was built. Long before California became a part of the United States, one man envisioned a radical idea that would change the course of history. Merchant Asa Whitney dreamed of a railroad connecting the West Coast to the rest of the country. In 1844, while returning from a trade expedition to China, Whitney had an epiphany. What if America could build a railroad stretching east to west and open up the enormous trade possibilities with the Chinese market? Back then, a trip from New York to the west coast of the United States meant one of three things. One choice was sailing to the Isthmus of Panama, unloading yourself and your cargo, trekking across the sweltering, dangerous jungle by land, and then reloading everything on another ship to continue the voyage. Another was to embark on a months-long sea voyage, enduring rough waters and freezing winds as you sailed all the way around the southern tip of South America, Cape Horn. The third option was to brave the Oregon Trail, a grueling overland trek filled with treacherous terrain, harsh weather, and the constant risk of exhaustion or attack. Ships took 43 days from New York to San Francisco through the Isthmus and 198 days from New York to Monterey around South America's Cape Horn. Survival was not guaranteed, as Cape Horn's waters famously wrecked over 800 ships since the 1500s. The Oregon Trail was also fraught with danger. The journey was long, taking 4 to 6 months on average. If travelers didn't die of cholera or dysentery, there was a chance of starvation or freezing to death. Asa Whitney knew there must be a better way to go west. So, in 1845, he petitioned Congress for land along a route west Lake Michigan to build his railroad and promised that it would be self-financing. Settlers would buy up land along the railroad tracks and that money would go to construction. When Congress reviewed Asa Whitney's bold proposal, they didn't just reject it. They dismissed it as pure fantasy. The first steam train in the U.S. had only started operating in 1830. And it trundled along 13 miles of track from Baltimore to some local mills. The idea of building a railroad across the entire, vast, little understood western U.S. seemed outlandish. But Asa Whitney was not one to give up easily. Undeterred by rejection, he embarked on a relentless 6-year publicity campaign, tirelessly advocating for his vision of a transcontinental railroad. Yet, despite his determination, Congress rejected his proposal one final time in 1851. Whitney walked away, never knowing that his dream, dismissed as impossible, would soon inspire others to turn it into reality. In 1848, the discovery of gold in the West set off a frenzy. Thousands of prospectors flooded into California, chasing dreams of fortune and a better life. Among those watching the chaos unfold was businessman Charles Lincoln Wilson, who realized something critical. The West needed a way to connect to these bustling hubs. A railroad wasn't just an idea anymore, it was a necessity. In 1854, he hired a young railroad surveyor out of New York, Theodore Judah, to go out to California and figure out how to build it. No one knew that this small project would turn into something much bigger, and Judah's name would go down in history. Under Judah's direction, the Sacramento Valley Railroad was built, linking the goldfields to Sacramento. And through that, the young engineer realized he wanted to take on a much bigger project, the Transcontinental Railroad. He proposed his plan to Washington, but though Congress was more open to the idea now, they had a different issue with it. Northern politicians fiercely opposed any route through the South, fearing it would enrich the slave-owning states that were already threatening secession. Meanwhile, Southern politicians refused to support a northern route, unwilling to hand economic power to their ideological enemy. Desperate to break the deadlock, Judah proposed a daring compromise, a railroad along the 41st parallel, splitting the difference between North and South, but when the politicians heard his plan, it was immediately dismissed. Judah's line would have to cross several deep ravines and go right through the granite Sierra Nevada mountain range. It would require an engineering accomplishment that had literally never been done before in the U.S. But Judah was convinced his route was best. He just needed to find a way to cross the steep, unruly Sierras. Chance brings him a Dutch flat storekeeper named Daniel Doc Strong, who told Judah he knew the best way to cross the mountains, through the Donner Pass. Judah checked the site and realized he had found his path, but there was still the problem of funding. In 1816, he lobbied the businessmen of Sacramento for funds and eventually found 4 visionaries who shared his belief in the railroad's potential: Charles Crocker, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins. Together, they became known as the Big Four. Judah was promised an equivalent number of shares as the businessmen, but their working relationship would soon turn sour. However, on the political side, a big breakthrough came about. On July 1, 1862, President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act, trying to keep afloat in the middle of the Civil War. Lincoln believed a transcontinental railroad would unite the country, joining East and West and proving the U.S. could function as a whole. Also, a recent, surprising, important invention had come about that would allow the railroad to be built: the telegraph. The first transcontinental telegraph line was completed in 1861. It allowed almost instantaneous communication between engineers. Company leaders and workers in the field could now communicate across vast distances with precision. It was a feat that had been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Judah was exhilarated by the passage of the Railway Act, but knew there was still a lot of work ahead. He telegraphed his partners and said, "We have drawn the elephant. Now, let us see if we can harness him up." The Pacific Railway Act stated that 2 companies would build the railroad, one heading east from Sacramento and the other heading west from the Missouri River. According to the act, companies could claim subsidies in the form of bonds and federal lands. They stood to gain 6,400 acres for every mile of track laid, $16,000 in bonds per mile in subsidies for flatland, $32,000 per mile laid in foothills, and $48,000 per mile laid in mountainous terrain. At that time, $48,000 was equal to almost $1.4 million in today's money. These incentives ignited a fierce competition between 2 railroad companies, each racing to lay track faster and farther than the other. The prize: vast stretches of land and lucrative government bonds that could make or break their fortunes. Lincoln approved a planned route suggested by engineer Grenville Dodge that would start from Council Bluffs, Iowa, and head west along the North Fork in Nebraska. These plans would soon be challenged due to one man's greed. But for now, the stage was set for one of the greatest competitions the world had ever seen. On January 8, 1863, the Central Pacific Railroad, the CPRR, broke ground in Sacramento, on the line that would connect the entire United States. Later that same year in December, the Union Pacific Railroad, the UPRR, would celebrate its own launch going westwards from Omaha, Nebraska. The race to build the Transcontinental Railroad was on. Though CPRR had a head start, they also had a drawback. The western route had significantly harder terrain, including ravines and mountains. But the first take-up happened on the Union Pacific side, and it was a major one.